Okay, so this marks the beginning of our look at the skeletal system. So, the skeletal system isn't just bones. We often think about the skeletal system as just being the bones, but it's the bones and their attendant structures. For the most part, what that means is the bones, cartilages, and this includes both the articular cartilages at the ends of bones, as well as some of the connective cartilages that go into making up cartilaginous joints, and ligaments. Ligaments are the dense, regular connective tissues that connect one bone to another bone. Collectively, all of these comprise the skeletal system, and specifically, it also includes the connective tissues that form what are called joint capsules, which are what make synovial joints, like say the elbow or the shoulder. And we'll talk about those more when we talk about articulations. The functions of the skeleton and the skeletal system are numerous. It's a major system in the body. Probably the most obvious of the functions is support. Your skeletal system provides support to your body. Without it, you just kind of like sort of sit there as a sack of flesh and meaty organs. Limb bones, vertebrae support the body. Jawbones support the teeth. Your some of your viscera and organs are connected to bones through connective tissue, things like that. Second, protection. Your skeleton is generally divided into two categories: the axial and the appendicular skeleton. With the appendicular being your limbs, like all the bones in your legs and arms, and the axial skeleton being most of the bones in your trunk. And the axial skeleton is pretty much devoted to protection. So the bones of your skull protect your brain. The bones of your vertebrae, while they do support your entire body and they play an extremely important role in movement, also protect your spinal cord from damage. Your ribs protect your heart and lungs from damage, and to a lesser extent, your pelvic girdle protects some important organs in that region from damage. That's less important, though. Movement. This is particularly important in the appendicular skeleton. So your appendages are basically how you move around. But all of your bones, pretty much, almost all of your bones, are involved in moving you in some way. They've all got muscles attached to them of one sort or another. And those muscles can be used to move bones relative to each other. If you're bending, stretching, moving around, to move your arms and legs so that you can move your body. Even to move things like the tissue of your face to make facial expressions and things like that. All right, so those are kind of the obvious ones. But let's get into the less obvious things that your skeleton does. Electrolyte balance. Electrolyte is a fancy term for ions. They're called electrolytes because, like, water by itself is not very electrically conductive at all. but add just a little bit of ions to it, and it becomes quite electrically conductive. So those are electrolytes. Basically, that's ions: sodium, chloride, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, all of those things. Your skeleton plays a particular role in regulating calcium levels in your blood. Calcium is exceptionally important to the functioning of both nerves and muscles. You need to have enough of it, but you don't want to have too much of it. And your skeleton is, of course, one of its primary components is calcium, specifically calcium phosphate. So when you have too much calcium, you put it on your bone. When you have too little calcium, you take apart some bone, and that releases calcium. The same is true for phosphate, but to a lesser extent. Phosphate levels are, your body's like basically more tolerant to phosphate levels, so it's less of a big deal if they go high or low. But phosphate is also stored in your bones. Acid-base balance. All right, so while your bones are primarily made out of calcium phosphate, they are also include calcium carbonate as a secondary component. And carbonate is a base. So one of the ways that your body can deal with too much acid is to release phosphate and carbonate levels into the blood. Phosphate's a little bit of a base. Carbonate is definitely a base, and you release carbonate into the blood, and the blood pH rises. You get rid of some acid. So the skeleton affects your acid-base balance. Blood formation. This is in the marrow of your bones, specifically the red marrow of your bones. This is where blood is formed, not just red blood cells, but also white blood cells and other formed elements of the blood. Without your skeletal system, you don't really have much of a circulatory system. Last, energy storage. You've got two types of marrow inside of your bones. The red marrow, like I just said, is concerned with making blood cells. The yellow marrow, which is actually probably the marrow you might be more familiar with if you've ever cooked with bones or cracked a bone to get at the marrow or anything like that. The yellow marrow is primarily fat. Fat tends to be kind of yellowish, and it's there for energy storage purposes. There are four general categories of bones: flat bones, long bones, short bones, and irregular bones. Flat bones usually are, flat, though they're also often curved, and they usually serve a protective feature. So, for instance, most of the bones in your skull are flat bones. Certainly, all of the bones in your cranium that make up the portion that protects your brain are flat bones. And some of the bones that make up your face are flat bones. So there's more variation there. Long bones. These bones are, long. They're usually much longer than they are wide. And they are primarily found in the appendicular skeleton. But this is your stereotypical bone that you think of, right? Like a long thing with some knobby ends, like your femur or tibia or whatever. Long bones are mostly involved in movement of one sort or another. And they act as levers. They're usually going to be highly attached by tendons to muscles. Short bones. Short bones are about as tall as they are wide. There are, a number of short bones in your body. The carpals in your wrist are short bones. Your vertebrae could be considered short bones, that they're also kind of irregular. These are able to glide across each other in multiple directions. So they provide options in terms of which way they're going to move. They're also often going to be good repositories of red bone marrow and sites where red blood cells will be made. And last, we have irregular bones. These are the bones that don't fit in any of the other categories. They've got a weird shape. Often they're made of the fusion of several other bones. They're kind of a catch-all. So let's talk about long bones and short bones. These are sort of your two basic bone categories, and we're going to use them as examples throughout this entire section. The long bones have two main areas. The diaphysis is what is found in the middle. It's the long portion of the long bone. And the diaphysis is primarily made out of what's called compact bone tissue. We'll talk about exactly what compact bone tissue is later on. And it's also usually hollow on the inside. So there's what's called a marrow cavity, a big open area on the inside. In the diaphysis region of compact bone, you usually have all of the collagen fibers, which have been crystallized with hydroxyapatite. We'll talk about that later. All running the same direction. And the diaphysis is usually very strong to forces applied in the direction of its length, but weaker to forces that are applied oblique to its length. The marrow cavity of the diaphysis is typically filled with yellow bone marrow. This is fatty and provides a nutrient source for your body in general, but also specifically to the bone. And within the bone marrow cavity, there are also flow blood vessels and nerves. The ends of a long bone are called the epiphysis. Epi means on top of, physis, bone, it's not really bone, but on top of the long bone structure. The epiphysis is usually going to be coated with articular cartilage, which is a hyaline cartilage. And the epiphysis is filled with what's called spongy bone. Spongy bone has a much thinner layer of compact, the epiphysis has a much thinner layer of compact bone on its outside, and inside it has thin sheets called trabeculae of bone that make up its entire inner structure. And that these thin interconnected sheets of bones are going to be what makes up the spongy bone. So you'd see it like forming all of these little interconnected trabecular plates. The spongy bone in the epiphysis is usually filled with red bone marrow. And that red bone marrow is filling up all of the spaces in between the spongy bits of the bone. And that's where blood is born. The in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis is a region called the epiphyseal line. This is in adults. In children who have not yet finished puberty, instead of just a thin epiphyseal line, they have a thicker area called the metaphysis, meta meaning middle, and the metaphysis is made of cartilage, hyaline cartilage, and that is how bones grow. When you become an adult and you exit puberty and your bones stop growing, that cartilage fuses into this bony line, which you can see here, here, and here. The bone, all bones, but certainly long bones, are also coated with a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue called the periosteum. Peri means around or nearby, and the periosteum actually has two layers. There's the connective layer, which is dense, irregular connective tissue, and it is primarily collagen fibers, and it's on the outside, on the superficial surface. And then there is what's called the osteogenic layer. This faces the bone itself, and the osteogenic layer is made of osteoblasts, which are cells that can make new bone tissue. Long bones will also have these little holes in them, spaced down their length. These are called nutrient foramens, and these are little holes in the bone so that blood vessels can enter and exit the internal portion of the bone. Remember, the inside here is where blood is made. All right, so you're making blood in here. That blood's got to get out to the rest of your body. So this blood will all connect into a blood vessel that will then flow out through a nutrient foramen. And bones are living tissue, which means that they need oxygen and they need nutrients. So you'll have oxygenated blood flowing into a nutrient foramen and then branching off. Flat bones usually consist of a curved sandwich with thin layers of compact bone on the outside, and in between them you have spongy bone called the diploe, and that spongy layer has these like trabecula of thin bone plates and spikes, and in between, in the cavities, you have red bone marrow. Flat bones are simply not as hard as long bones. They've got less compact bone tissue. Compact bone tissue is very, very hard. What they are is a little bit more durable. With a long bone, you know, if you bend it too much, it tends to crack. Here, this spongy portion, the diploe, it is kind of spongy. And so it will actually absorb shock better. So this bone has a tendency to be a little bit better about, you know, taking blows without actually shattering. And again, we have a periosteum coating the outer and inner surface of the compact bone. So, just to reiterate, for this presentation, you need to know the components of the skeletal system. bones, cartilages, and ligaments. You need to know the functions of the skeletal system that we discussed. You need to know the 4 types of bones: long, short, flat, and irregular. And you should be able to recognize the anatomical features of long and flat bones: diaphysis, epiphysis, epiphyseal plate, nutrient foramen, know where there's going to be yellow and red marrow, all of that sort of thing.